Hello, welcome to Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. Thank you all for saying all of your swear words before we started recording. That was helpful. We're going to go ahead and let me bring up the presentation for tonight. There we are. And let me go ahead and turn on this screen share. There we go. And I can see you all, your shiny, lovely face. Not shiny faces, I'm sorry. That would imply you don't have a proper amount of powder. Your smiling faces. There we go. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, Lord of heaven and earth, we humbly pray that your gracious providence may give and preserve to our use the harvest of the land and of the seas, and may prosper all who labor to gather them, that we who are constantly receiving good things from your hand may always give you thanks through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. This is, of course, once more that collect for fruitful seasons that is much neglected in the prayer book, but we're using throughout the book of Joshua. Reminder for those of us who might not know what we're doing for the classes. Of course, these are our two key books, the NRSV and How to Read the Bible book by book. Great synopsis. But most of the material tonight will be coming from Creech's commentary on Joshua in the interpretation series once more. But let's review a little bit. And I know Karen was reviewing before class, so she's going to nail all of these review questions. She was practicing for this pop quiz. So let's start. How would you, anyone at all, not just Karen, how would you describe the march through the Jordan into the promised land? And why would you describe it that way? Go. Anyone. Don't all just jump in.
Recapitulates the crossing of the Red Sea, essentially.
Excellent. Recapitulates the crossing of the Red Sea. I like it. Anyone else? What's is it? Would you describe it as a military procession?
A religious procession.
Yes, right. It's a religious procession. The Ark of the Covenant is the focal point. And the procession itself is preceded by the sanctification of the people. So it's structured as a ritual observance. What was Joshua's role in the entrance in the promised land? Is he kind of like General MacArthur? Or, I mean, you could pick your era, I guess, what great general you wanted to do. I have to say, Tony, this is going to be on the YouTube now. I'm almost done with section 1 of the book you gave me, and I'm loving it. Tony bought me as a gift The Vicar of Christ, which was a book from 35 years ago. It's very interesting, very fascinating. But all of the military language from the first section, his buddy in the military, is, I have no idea what's going on half the time. I keep having to looking things up on the internet. I don't know how people read books like this before you could Google, what are these things? But thank you, Tony. I'm loving the book.
Yeah, the second part will be in a totally different voice.
So, I'm excited.
Yeah.
Joshua's role in this is a prophet. Remember, a prophet and the second Moses. He receives instruction directly from God. He directs the ritual procession. This is not necessarily a military commander as we would generally think of it. And then what event is echoed and foreshadowed in that should be crossing. Sorry, I'll fix that before I post these. We already got that from Carolyn. It echoes the crossing in the Red Sea. That great line, the waters stood in a heap. I even remember when I was a kid hearing that and thinking that sounded strange. So that strange language is reiterated here, but it's foreshadowing as well, right? The authority transfer between Elijah and Elisha, maybe even the ministry of John the Baptist. This becomes a significant motif in Scripture, this crossing through the Red Sea that we see here. How was the crossing memorialized?
12 rocks.
12 rocks, right? Yeah. And we're not quite sure, were they taken from the riverbed and put on the shore? Were they built in the middle of the riverbed? It seems to be we get both stories kind of pushed together. But regardless, 12 stones which symbolize the unity of the tribes at the time of the conquest. Wonderful. Great question here. Was Jericho an ancient fortified city?
Yes. Oh, well. Oh. No.
Was it?
No. Oh, yeah. Nancy was listening better.
Nancy, only some of you show up on the side of my screen. Yeah, no, not in the Bronze Age. Remember, in the Bronze Age, which is the time of Joshua, instead, this narrative is assuming that Jericho from the 10th to 10,000 to 7,000 BC, when it was a fortified city by then. But back in the Bronze Age, it was little more than a settlement, really. How would you characterize this ancient siege story we get? Once again, is this a traditional military siege that Joshua wages?
No.
No, right? It's once more a liturgical siege. It's a ritual procession, right? It almost mirrors the Passover celebrations. So one more of you question here. You're doing a great job on these quizzes, everyone except for Karen. Reading theologically, if we read the text theologically, and we understand there's this complete destruction of Jericho, which is unsettling for us, right? Of course. How do we understand that complete destruction theologically? What is the argument being made? This is a great short answer question. You want to take a stab at it? A complete destruction was common in the ancient Near East after a siege historically, and yet this one is distinct because the people don't keep the loot from their victory, and that's making a theological argument that this is not their victory, but it is God's victory, and also that the people should not profit from God's just punishment upon an oppressive city, right? That wouldn't be appropriate, and so the people don't profit from the liberation. Is kind of what's going on there, at least if you read the text theologically. And of course, you can disagree with me and think it's genocidal and that Jared's too soft on the Bible, and well, then you can have your own class. See who comes. And then we did the juxtaposition, right? This taking two texts and smushing them together. And we see that there's a real good juxtaposition between Jericho and Rahab and the city of Ai and Achan. Do y'all remember this juxtaposition, right? So Rahab's a prostitute, Achan's an Israelite. Rahab hid the spies, Achan hid the spoils from the conquest in Jericho. Rahab acknowledges God has given the land away, saying our hearts melted away. Achan is unfaithful to God, and so the hearts of the Israelites are the ones who melt away in his narrative. In Rahab's story, the covenant, she uses covenant language because of the chesed I have shown, show chesed to me. And in the Achan narrative, the covenant is transgressed twice. It's reiterated. In the Rahab story, her entire family is saved. In the Achan story, he and his family are stoned. And so this is undergirding that idea. And then God sends Joshua back to Ai, and the city of Ai is defeated in chapter 8. But this is undergirding that idea that though there is this idea of the ban or the complete destruction of the people in Joshua, that Joshua itself seems uncomfortable with that command by creating this exception of Rahab, who is this faithful person, and contrasting this faithful Canaanite who should be killed in this genocidal conquest, if you read Joshua that way, contrasting her as this faithful person compared to Achan, this Israelite who is unfaithful. So it seems that faithfulness to God is much more important in the book of Joshua, and that's why you kind of get the idea that maybe the book of Joshua is a story of liberation more than one of genocidal conquest when you read the text theologically. Questions on any of that? It's kind of a brief pop through what we did last week. All right. Well, let's go ahead and let the conquest continue. We're going to move to chapter 9 of Joshua. So let me open that up here. Joshua 9, verses 1 through 15. Now, when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland along the coast of the Great Sea towards Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together with one accord to fight Joshua and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they on their part acted with cunning. They went and prepared provisions and took worn out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended and worn out patched sandals on their feet and worn out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and moldy. They went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We've come from a far country, so now make a treaty with us." Or the Israelites said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you live among us. How then can we make a treaty with you?" They said to Joshua, "Oh, we are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They said to him, "Your servants come from a very far country, very far, because the name of the Lord your God, we have heard a report of him and of all that he did in Egypt and of all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, King Sihon of Heshbon, King Og of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, 'Take provisions in your hand for the journey. Go and meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now and make a treaty with us. Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we came out to you. But now, see, it's dry and moldy. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and see, they're burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey." So the leaders partook of their provisions and did not ask direction from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them, guaranteeing their lives by a treaty. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. This is such a ridiculously hilarious, awesome, fun story. So the Gibeonites are identified as Hivites in this text. So the Hivites were a group that migrated to Canaan from Anatolia being what we think of as most of modern day Turkey, many centuries earlier, before the entrance of the Israelites into the land. So this is a migratory group as well, the Hivites. Like earlier characters that we've read in the Bible, such as Jacob and Joseph and Tamar, the Hivites are a marginalized people who improve their lot through trickery, right? They actually, in a lot of ways, resemble Rahab from chapter 2, who outsmarts her own people to save the spies. We have to kind of remember that this idea of using trickery to save yourself, we think of this as dishonest. Well, who would be dishonest? You must always be honest. This is the kind of like the Mr. Rogers version of the Bible, right? And as much as I love Mr. Rogers, the Bible loves people who trick people. It thinks it's fantastic. And there's a lot of stories about people using trickery to save themselves. And so the Gibeonites kind of exist in that stream. And we have to remember that a covenant is irrevocable. Even if you had deceived someone to get the covenant, once the covenant is made, the covenant is made. It is taken very seriously in the ancient Near East. Israel in this text is not only foolish. I mean, why would they believe these people? Oh, we've got moldy bread and worn out clothes, which clearly, like, yeah, so they brought moldy bread and worn out clothes. Like, not only is Israel foolish, but even more importantly, Israel does not seek direction from God, is what is said in the text. They did not inquire after the Lord as to what to do. They took it in their own hands, figured they could figure it out for themselves. And that's going to be the problem that'll trip them up in this story. So let's see what's going to happen. Continuing in verse 16. But when 3 days had passed after they made a treaty with them, Israel made a treaty with the Gibeonites. Israel heard that the Gibeonites were their neighbors and were living among them. So the Israelites set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Shephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the congregation, "We've sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we must not touch them. This is what we will do to them. We will let them live so that wrath may not come upon us because of the oath we swore to them." And the leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they, the Gibeonites, became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation, as the leaders had decided concerning them. And Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and said to them, "Why did you deceive us, saying we're very far from you, while in fact you're living among us? Now, therefore, you are cursed. Some of you shall always be slaves, hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God." And they answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy the inhabitants of the land before you. So we were in great fear for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now we are in your hand. Do as seems good and right in your sight to do to us. And this is what Joshua did for them. He saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. But on that day, Joshua made them hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to continue to this day in the place that he should choose. So this section, we're thinking likely could have been composed later. It perhaps is explaining the slave status of some foreigners in the time of King Solomon. Kind of, this is an etiological reading. This is explaining why it is that we have these slaves working in the temple, that it goes back to this story from the conquest. That's one theory that scholars have with regarding to all of this. But notice that it is the leaders in this text who are implicated for a hasty decision and did not consult with God. And the congregation gets it, and that's why the congregation murmurs against the people. Most of the against the leaders. Most of the time when the congregation murmured before, in the wilderness narratives, it was because of their lack of faith. But here, the congregation is murmuring because of the lack of faithfulness of the leadership. So there's a shift occurring at this moment in Joshua. That said, the Gibeonites are saved, but they're given a low status in the land, safe from destruction, contrary to the requirements of the ban, right? But in chapter 10, as we'll discover, Israel even comes to Gibeon's aid. So not only are they saved, but Israel finds themselves connected to them, knit to them in some very important way. Unlike other, and this is the big difference between the Gibeonites and why I think the deception works, is unlike the other inhabitants of the land, the Gibeonites are like Rahab. They affirm the power of God, they affirm the divine manifest destiny of the conquest, and they even acknowledge the ban that the Israelites must utterly destroy. So these covenant words are placed in the mouths of the Gibeonites. And this kind of goes back to this idea that maybe the idea of the conquest of Canaan wasn't genocide, but was it any of the Canaanites could have been saved had they chosen to acknowledge God, to be faithful to the Torah? Then they wouldn't have had to be murdered and killed. And these are examples proving that even though the ban did not allow exceptions, the people did take exception with Rahab and with the Gibeonites because both of them were faithful to the ideals and precepts of the Torah. The story also prepares us, though, for struggles with idolatry we get in Judges 2 through 16. So this is going to kind of come back to bite us in the end when we get to the next text. Question? Yeah, Tony.
Can I just ask a quick question? I was curious, you brought up the Torah. That's something I've been thinking about lately, is how well established was the Torah by Joshua's time?
That's a really good question. So probably not, right? Probably in the time of this is we really need to read the book of Joshua as a very anachronistic text. It's not really presenting historically what happened, but it's taking the Torah as it was established probably in the 8th century in the time of Josiah and reading that back into the conquest narrative and telling the story with that lens. Most likely. I mean, that's what most scholars would say. That said, if you want to take the text on face value, then the way Joshua presents it is that the people were given the land, the Torah at Sinai. They came to the promised land, failed miserably, didn't trust in God, so they wound up wandering for 40 years, come back to the promised land, are given the Torah a second time in the book of Deuteronomy, where it's kind of all reaffirmed to them. And then the foundation of justice envisioned in the Torah is what is the foundation upon which the conquest then takes place with Joshua. That's the way the text presents it, even though historically it probably wasn't quite that clean. But that's kind of the theological assumption of the text in Deuteronomy and Joshua. Other questions? So what happens next? So I mentioned that in chapter 10, there's this, the Gibeonites have need and the Israelites save the Gibeonites. And it's kind of this whole thing, but I can't read the entire Bible with you. We would be doing this Intro to the Hebrew Bible class forever. So we're going to pop ahead to chapter 11 now, to go ahead and look a little bit at the conquest of the Canaanites as that conquest is described. So, beginning in verse 1, when King Jabin of Hazor heard of this, he sent King Joab of Madon, the king of Shimron, to King Ashphath, whatever that is, and the kings who were in the northern hill country and in the Arava south of Shinneroth, and in the lowland and in Naphoth Dor in the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. They came out with all their troops, a great army, a number like the sand on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. All these kings joined their forces and came and camped together at the waters of Merom to fight with Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will hand over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua came suddenly upon them with all his fighting force by the waters of Merom, and he fell upon them, and the Lord handed them over to Israel, who attacked them and chased them as far as the great Sidon, in Mishrafoth Maim, and eastwards as far as the valley of Mizpah. They struck them down until they had left no one remaining, and Joshua did to them as the Lord commanded him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor and struck its king down with a sword. Before that time, Hazor was the head of all those kingdoms, and they put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. And all the towns of those kings and all their kings Joshua took and struck them with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But Israel burned none of the towns that stood on mounds except Hazor, which Joshua did burn. All of the spoils of these towns and the livestock the Israelites took for their booty, but all the people they struck down with the edge of the sword until they destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. As Joshua had commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Well, that's a depressing story. I could see the look of terror on Nancy's face every time I talked about hamstringing the horses. I just wanted to go hug a horse, bring them an apple. So chapter 10 had told the story of the brutal and successful southern campaign of the conquest. And so what chapter 11 is doing is now turning to the conquest of the northern part of Canaan. This is the final instance as well in Joshua of a hearing motif, which had been constant in the conquest narrative of Joshua. This is not the first. If we'd been reading everything in Joshua, we would have heard this several times. When King blank heard ... he sent blank. That was repeated over and over again in the conquest narrative. This is the last time that happens. The destruction that takes place here of the northern region is of all of the royal city-states. And this is one of the reasons why some scholars think that the seed of the story in Joshua is not the conquest of an external people, but instead was a peasant revolt against oppressive city-state monarchs. So, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, the text forbids a king from owning too many horses, because that is an accumulation of military power, which enables you to oppress the poor. This is why this is not allowed. And so the reason for the hamstringing of the horses is not about just like horrible violence, but is to take away the military power of these city-states so that they can no longer oppress the people and the poor among them. It's terrifying for us to hear it, and we want to think, well, couldn't they, send the horses all over to Nancy's house to live with them? Wouldn't that be better than Nancy would be great? She'd give them all of the apples they want, but that's not going to happen in the ancient Near East, right? And so what this is about, it's not about violence against animals and stuff like that. What this is about is taking the power of oppressive city-states away from them so that they cannot rise up again in injustice and oppression. By ridding the land of this oppressive royal city-state power and this military might, then the society that is envisioned by the Torah, the society of justice and peace, can truly be established. But this conquest, this liberation has to take place first. Questions? Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
So, in essence, what the stories are saying is that the means don't make any difference as long as you achieve the ends. You can do it anyway.
Not
that you do.
necessarily, because they're not allowed just any means to get to this end. They're not allowed to rape and pillage the city, which would have been normal at the time. They're not allowed to take the inhabitants as slaves, which would have been normal at the time. The means are definitely offensive to us as kind of people in the 21st century, but by contemporary standards, the means were actually way less horrible. And even that instance of hamstringing the horses, I mean, what they should have done is they should have taken the horses for themselves to increase their own military might. The fact that they didn't do that demonstrates that the Israelites cannot take the military power these city-states had, or the other option would have been to kill all the horses, right? But you don't do that either. You hamstring them so they can't be powerful, but you don't kill them. And so it feels terrifying for us and unsettling for us, but set against the ancient Near East, this is a massive drawback of what would have been standard operating procedure.
Yeah, hell, I'm not familiar with that concept of hamstringing a horse. Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah, I've got a video of it happening. I'm going to put up right now. So what?
I guess I asked for it, didn't I?
Right, you did. What this is you're cutting a powerful muscle or tendon in the legs of a horse, which basically lames the horse.
It's like an Achilles tendon, right?
Yeah. And so you're not killing the horse, but you're making it so this horse is going to be worthless for battle. You're not going to use this horse for any kind of military power in the future. So once again, it sounds horrible to us, but set against the context of what would have happened most naturally. And I really think, because remember, so much of the story of Joshua is about how do we keep the people away from the temptations of these wicked Canaanite kingdoms. And hamstringing the horses is like getting rid of the idolatry. We don't want them to be tempted to think, oh, wow, now we have all these horses and chariots. We can do whatever the hell we want. The people don't succeed militarily because of their military might. That is a gigantic bottle of water. Dear God, Karen, what was that? It's like a jug of moonshine or something. Jeez, oh Pete, I'm sorry, I got distracted. But what it's really kind of massively interesting. They're afraid even of the people acquiring military might, and so you hamstring the horses to take the temptation away, right?
Yep. This is troubling, where they go in and take the city and kill everybody and destroy everything. We would never do that. That would be a war crime, and we would not do that. We just bomb it from the air.
Right.
So much more humane to kill somebody when you can't see them.
Yeah. Well, and we of course have also, we know when we would conquer something, we would take out all of the goods. You know, we take the military might for ourselves, or but we wouldn't destroy it. Why wouldn't you want more power?
Yeah, well, you tend to, because we're more likely to use long range artillery and bombs, instead of going in there.
Yeah.
And picking up.
I mean, I think the one thing I love about the book of Joshua, for all of the things that make us uncomfortable, it is a story in horrible military tactics, right? The whole book is like, this is not how you conquer. No, like a military, like someone studying at West Point would read this book and be like, this is the stupidest ideas I've ever heard, because it's not about military might. It's about God enabling the liberation of a wicked and oppressive area. And that's what I love, the theory of the peasant revolt. That's what actually the seeds of Israel was a peasant revolt. And then, of course, as we go later in the story, they do wind up being seduced by idolatry, being seduced by military power, and doing horrible things. And God judges them for it. They lose the promised land. They lose everything because of that. But it's kind of envisioning here, it started right. It started the way it should be. Even if we wound up failing in the end, it's trying to envision this, it's almost like kind of some of the hagiographic stuff with the Revolutionary War that we look back now and we're like, well, maybe some of that's actually a little problematic. But I'm still going to listen to Hamilton and sing at the top of my lungs. I'm just going to. I'm not going to be ashamed. Um, it's like that, I think, for this. And as well, remember, this is, if you buy the theory that this is being composed in the time of Josiah, right? When the people are trying to reform the country, to bring back faithful religion, to bring back a monarchy that, follows justice. They're seeing this conquest as their model. And that's why the story is being told, is to encourage the people to come back to God and to start living justly and faithfully once more. Wild stuff, not easy. Let's push along and talk about the successes of Joshua beginning in verse 16. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negev, and all the land of Goshen and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, as far as Baal-gad, in the land of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He took all their kings, struck them down, and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites except the Hivites, inhabitants of Gibeon. All were taken in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their heart, so that they would come against Israel in battle, in order that they might be utterly destroyed, and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And at that time Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Deir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the Israelites. Some remained only in Gaza and in Gath and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from the war. So a few things to note here. Notice that the violent aggression of the kings against Israel is what's highlighted here, compared with the responses of people like the Gibeonites. Twice it's noted that Joshua took the whole land, verses 16 and 23, securing the rest that had been promised in the beginning of Joshua, chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. The name of the place that's captured here is very difficult to reconcile with ancient geography at the time of the conquest. This better resembles the ideal boundaries of the kingdom in the time of King Josiah. So once again, this is probably not a scientific historical recreation, but is like the imagining of the idealized hopes of the people in the time of King Josiah. Other interesting thing I would put here that I didn't put on the slide is that Joshua destroys the Anakim. So the Anakim are the descendants of in theory, according to if you follow the text, so the Nephilim, right? The sons of God in Genesis saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they made babies with them. And then they made giants that were the Nephilim before the time of the flood. And then the flood happened and they went away. And then the Anakim are kind of the last descendants of those giants. And we'll see those Anakim pop up again in the story of David and Goliath, because Goliath is seen as one of the last of the Anakim, these giant people who inhabited the land. So lots of fun. But there's a little point being made there that's a thread that occurs throughout the text. Questions? Just keeping up pace here. And so the process of the allotment of the land begins then in chapter 14. So let me do that here. Joshua 14, verses 1 through 5. These are the inheritance that the Israelites received in the land of Canaan, which the priest Eleazar and Joshua son of Nun and the heads of the families of the tribes of the Israelites distributed to them. Their inheritance was by lot, as the Lord had commanded Moses for the 9.5 tribes. For Moses had given an inheritance to the 2.5 tribes beyond the Jordan, but to the Levites he gave no inheritance among them. For the people of Joseph were 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. And no portion was given to the Levites in the land, but only towns to live in with their pasture lands and for their flocks and herds. And the Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses. They allotted the land. So you can see on this map here the way that the allotment kind of worked out. You can see this is not about everyone getting the same amount of space. So you can do with that what you will. There are some theories that maybe some of the tribes were smaller and so didn't need as much space. or there are theories that some parts of the land were richer and therefore were worth more, even if they were smaller, but there's no real way of knowing any of that for sure. These are just the allotments that are given as they're described in the book of Joshua. To maintain the number of tribes at 12, the people of Joseph were counted as 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, to make up the lack of Levi's inheritance, because the Levites don't get land. Their job is to take care of the temple. The tribes of the Transjordan, so that would be those to the east of the Jordan, are handled first in chapter 13, verses 8 through 33, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So you can see there on that map, on the eastern side of the Jordan, the Transjordan tribes given their allotment. And then in chapter 14, Eleazar, who is the chief priest, who helped commission Joshua way back in Numbers 27, along with Joshua and the other tribal families, oversaw the allotment of Canaan itself. And the allotment was done by lot, that is, by the word of the Lord, or the work of the Lord. So it's not that this is by chance, it's some kind of great lottery, you like, turn the bingo thing in. Hey, Manasseh, B1, you get Megiddo and Jezreel and Shechem. Woohoo! So the idea of it being by lot is that you're trusting that God is deciding how the lot will fall, and that's how people are going to determine what parts of the land they get. And then the allotment itself, that's what the process is introduced in chapter 14, those first few verses, and then it continues with the allotment begins in chapter 15. The lot for the tribe of the people of Judah, according to their families, reached southwards to the boundary of Edom, to the wilderness of Zin at the farthest south, and their southern boundary ran from the end of the Dead Sea, from the bay that faces southwards. It goes out southwards to the ascent of Akrabim, passes along to Zin, and goes up south of Kadesh Barnea, along Hezron up to Adar, makes a turn to Karka. I just fell asleep, sorry. Just real briefly there. That is literally what the rest of this sounds like. It is impossible to understand. However, we're not going to read it all. The point, we're going to cover the theological points. Even Carolyn's yawning. Judah's allotment is first because Judah takes priority among all the tribes west of the Jordan, which is significant because, of course, remember, Judah forms the southern kingdom, right? The southern kingdom of Judah, which winds up persisting past the northern kingdom of Israel. The allotment actually begins in chapter 14, verse 6, when Caleb requests and is given Hebron due to his faithfulness, one of the 2 remaining members of the first generation. Caleb kind of comes to the leader. He says, hey, Joshua and I were the only 2 spies that thought this could happen. So everyone else died in the wilderness, but I still live. And so I would like to request Hebron. And he gets it because he is indeed one of those only faithful people from the last generation. You can see Hebron included in the map there. The land grant narrative for a specific person, like in Caleb, actually occurs again in Joshua chapter 17 and then in chapter 21. 2 of the others are women who get a land grant, technically aren't even allowed to inherit property, but they are given a specific land grant because of their faithfulness. This is to underscore in Joshua that all Israelites will share in the promise. And this is kind of one of those radically egalitarian things that you find in the Deuteronomic narrative. The allotment is carefully drawn, however, to exclude Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is not captured and does not become an Israelite territory until David captures it later. And everyone knows that David is the one who captured Jerusalem. So even though they're ignoring a lot of the likely history at this time, you can't ignore that history because you can't take David's thunder for being the person that captures Jerusalem. So that's an odd place where they want to be very careful to be historically accurate in this text. 3 towns were also listed: Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, which were important, which are listed. They were important Assyrian cities. Actually, they weren't important probably at the time of Joshua, and they're listed here to undergird Israel's claim to the land. These important Assyrian cities had been part of what was given to the nation of Israel during the conquest. That's an important note. Questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I didn't understand what you were saying about Jerusalem and David. It kind of all went kind of fast.
That's fine. So they don't get Jerusalem yet,
Yeah.
because Jerusalem isn't conquered until David winds up being the person who conquers Jerusalem. several generations later. And so for all of the places where Joshua is massively historically inaccurate, where we can just tell from archaeology and whatnot, it's interesting that they're accurate here on the point that the Israelites did not have Jerusalem at this time. And the reason for the accuracy is because the fact that David conquers Jerusalem is one of the most important parts of the Israelite narrative. And so they can't fake that part of the story. They can pretend that the cities were bigger and that we were more powerful, because who knows what it was like back then. But you can't take David's thunder, because David conquered Jerusalem.
Okay.
Thanks for calling that up, Barbara. Other questions or thoughts or comments? So then as we move forward, there are also special allotments that are not given to tribes, but are allotments for justice. And we'll see those beginning in Joshua chapter 20. Verses 1-9. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, say to the Israelites, appoint cities of refuge, of which I spoke to you through Moses, so that anyone who kills a person without intent or by mistake may flee there. They shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood. The slayer shall flee to one of these cities, and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and explain the case to the elders of that city. Then the fugitive shall be taken into that city and given a place, and shall remain with them. And if the avenger of blood is in pursuit, they shall not give up the slayer, because the neighbor was killed by mistake, there having been no enmity between them before. The slayer shall remain in that city until there's a trial before the congregation, until the death of the one who is high priest at that time. Then the slayer may return home to the town in which the deed was done. Stop it. So they set apart Kadesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, and Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. And beyond the Jordan, east of Jericho, they appointed Bezar in the wilderness of the tableland from the tribe of Reuben, and Ramoth in Gilead from the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan from the tribe of Manasseh. These were the cities designated for all the Israelites and for the aliens residing among them, that anyone who killed a person without intent could flee there, so as not to die by the hand of the avenger of blood until there was a trial before the congregation. So like so much else in Joshua, this is following Moses's guidelines in Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 19, verses 1-13. These cities of refuge are established to give someone who committed involuntary manslaughter, is what we would call it in our own time, asylum until the case could be adjudicated. This helped limit the social damage of unrestrained blood vengeance or feuding, which was very common in the ancient Near East. So this is yet another example of this being much a kinder and gentler law than what you would generally find in ancient Near Eastern countries. And this underscores the difference, I think, in the book of Joshua between the war of conquest / liberation and the goal of establishing a society of justice under the Torah. Joshua is not comfortable with killing lots and lots of people, even though it feels that way at times. But even here, once the land is finally liberated and the Torah is being established, we're even going to make sure that, even though according to ancient custom, if you kill someone even unintentionally, blood demands blood. That's the law of lex talionis, right? Eye for an eye. That we're not going to live that way as the people. We're going to have these refuge cities to protect people. In chapter 21, these same cities are also named as Levitical cities. So these are the cities the Levites will have, along with 42 other cities, along with others, for a total of 42 cities that are the Levitical cities. The Levitical cities comes from service to the Lord. That's what their inheritance is. But they still need a place to live. The Levites still need a place to pasture their flocks. And so they're giving these Levitical cities. Remember as well that we're not quite sure at this time, because it's unclear. According to Deuteronomy, the only place you can worship is in the temple of Jerusalem, which doesn't yet exist. But also at this time, the people seem to be worshiping all kinds of holy places. And so it seems to be that the Levites are working in these cities so that they may tend to the holy places around the country before those holy places are suppressed later in the time of Josiah. That's likely. Questions on that? All right, and I think this is the last section we're going to read, is in chapter 23, verses 1-11. A long time afterwards, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies all around, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, their elders and heads, their judges and officers, and he said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore, be very steadfast to observe and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left, so that you may not be mixed with these nations left here among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow yourselves down to them. But hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no one has been able to withstand you to this day. One of you puts flight to 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you as he promised. Be very, very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. So Joshua, and I'm not gonna read the rest of the speech. That just gives you a taste of it. Joshua's speech here mirrors the prior testaments of Jacob in Genesis 48 and 49, the testament of Joseph in Genesis 50, and the testament especially of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 through 33. This idea of this kind of testament by a patriarch before they die is this motif we've seen several times. It consists almost entirely of Deuteronomic reflections. That is, a remembrance of God's mighty acts, verses 1 through 5, an exhortation to remain faithful, verses 6 through 11, and a warning of judgment if they are unfaithful. This is basically the structure of Deuteronomy, this idea that we're going to remember the acts of God, we're going to be told what faithfulness looks like, and we're going to be warned what happens if we're not faithful. These warnings set the stage for the narrative of Judges, as I'd mentioned earlier, especially chapters 2 through 16 of Judges. This speech also anticipates the defeat and exile of the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century, and then of the southern kingdom of Judah in the 6th century, because we're seeing what would be the reasons why that would happen. When those things did happen, the people could not believe that they could lose the promised land. So in this text, it's being explained that from the very beginning that God had set limits for our behavior and causes by which we could forfeit the land. Questions, comments, thoughts?
This is very irrelevant, but I was just curious. The name Cohen is sometimes referred to as a rabbi class or a teaching class or a priestly class. Did that evolve from the Levites at all?
That's a really good question, Tony. So the Hebrew word for Cohen is the word for priest specifically. Let's go ahead and let me bring this up here so I can show this to you with my favorite Hebrew Bible study website, which is blueletterbible.org. So let me flip on the screen share towards that. Zoom, share screen, Blue Letter Bible. So, So Zedek is priest. I'm trying to think of the best way to get to it. Cohen. That's not gonna work. All right, here we go.
Yeah.
We'll let Wikipedia help us. You could do this yourself on your own time. So it's the Hebrew word for priest is used in reference to the Aaronic priesthood. The Levitical priests, or Kohanim, are traditionally believed and halakhically required to direct patrilineal descent from the biblical Aaron or the brother of Moses. So the Kohanim are the priests. That's just the word for priests in Hebrew. And etymologically, it derives from a Semitic root. In the polytheistic religions of Phoenicia, the word for priest was also a KHN. The cognate Arabic word KHN is similar as well. This was not significant to Israel because it's also used for the priests of Baal, the priests of Dagon. Though interestingly enough, Christian priests in modern Hebrew are not called Cohen, they're called Komer. So that's funny. I guess I get a different word. And Kohanim can also refer to the entire Jewish nation because they, of course, are a priestly nation in Exodus 19.
Yeah.
Other
Hey,
question? Go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So in the Jewish faith, would they have the same perspective of Joshua as you've talked about, if you're taking it from what, a theological perspective as opposed to literal or historical or whatever?
Well, it would depend on what strand of Judaism you're talking about. So, of course, you know, Hasidic Orthodox Judaism is going to be much more similar to our own fundamentalism in the states. But most Reformed or conservative Judaism is founded upon solid biblical scholarship. And one of the great things I loved about focusing on Hebrew Bible studies in college and graduate school is it doesn't make a difference if you're a Christian or a Jew. Like good Hebrew studies scholarship, because in good modern Hebrew Bible scholarship, you're not always making everything about Jesus. You're just not. You want to understand the text itself. And so, you know, Reformed Judaism, conservative Judaism also would all not have the same kind of fundamentalist need for these texts to be perfectly historically and literally accurate. That would be kind of a weird thing for a modern Jewish person to think. This is why, you know, for example, you know, I always think it's hilarious when people talk about how the Bible is so very clear on questions of sexuality and abortion, when the vast majority of modern Judaism is pretty liberal on both of those questions, and they're like literally reading the Bible in Hebrew. So clearly, like, there's more than one way of thinking about this stuff. So it would really depend on what strand you're talking about.
So when Israel was established in the 1940s, or reestablished in the 1940s, why did it take the more violent approach to protecting the land as opposed to, you know, the idea that you're sharing in a kinder, gentler place and being? So why are the violence and not
So two reasons I would say. One is there is tremendous sympathy on the world stage because of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was horrible. And so there's tremendous sympathy for the Jewish people and a desire for them to have a place that would be safe. And so there's a willingness to turn an eye, I would say, because the ends seem to justify the means. That's one part of it. The other part of it, I would say, is probably from the perspective of the conquering people who founded the nation of Israel, is that on number one, they were doing exactly what Joshua did. These, you know, Palestinians are wicked people, and we're liberating the land and taking back what was rightfully ours, and that we're doing what of course we should do, even though I would say that that's probably not what Joshua was doing. And there's no real correlation between ancient Canaanites and 20th century Palestinians. I would say that, but in the heat of getting the promised land back for the first time in however many hundreds and hundreds of years, that was a powerful sentiment. And I mean, and that gets, you know, ginned up by religious leaders, political leaders at the time, like Ben Gurion and others, who really believed that this was God's answer to the Holocaust, was to give this land to the nation of Israel. And I mean, I think it remains a really thorny question. You know, I've got a lot of whenever I've been in Israel, I always spend more time around Palestinian Christians than I do around modern Israelis. And to this day, it's a very, very vexed question, even in Israel. And yeah,
Especially this became the dominant viewpoint, that it's ours biblically, it's ours because we bought it. They didn't invade and take it, they bought the land. But there wasn't a strong strain that didn't win out that said that this is wrong. Taking essentially your view of Joshua, this describes the Lord acting. They march around Jericho. They don't, you know, storm it with bazookas. if the Lord isn't giving it to you, this is wrong and it's violating everything. That's not, even back when the Zionists were purchasing the land in the 19th century, there were some Jews who questioned this, that this is something that God will do. This is something the Messiah will do. This is not for human beings to do. That side essentially lost out. Though what some of the deeply Orthodox Jews don't serve in Israel, don't serve in the army. That's not the way they see what God wants them to do.
Have
Yeah.
you seen some of the or more than Orthodox Jews
Yeah.
that are ultra, and they don't even approve of the state of Israel? And there's some that have been seen, they have reports on YouTube. They've been sitting there with the Ayatollahs talking and saying how much they like them, and they hope they come and judge Israel, because
Lord,
Israel is such a state that's anti-God, and they're not doing things and letting God and the Messiah bring in the kingdom.
Yeah, there's been a lot of really good stuff written about the odd intersections of Christianity, Judaism, Zionism, white supremacy, and all of this stuff. It's really this very, very, this situation was created by a lot of things working together, and it's going to be very hard. There's a reason why no president has yet been able to successfully untie the knot. It's sad. And so for me, this is kind of like I talked about on Sunday. This is one of those faceless needs. I feel like it's just gigantic in the world. I don't know what I can do. And so for me as a Christian, I try really hard to support the Anglican Diocese of Jerusalem, which works really hard on peacemaking, and they focus on giving education to Palestinian children, figuring if we can get these Palestinian kids educated, they can maybe get better jobs, they can maybe be less likely to be drawn into terrorism. And they work on, my desire before I had a kid had been to do my sabbatical, actually living in Jerusalem and working with the diocese there, because the Diocese of Jerusalem does very good stuff. And in the face of tremendous persecution. I mean, a few years ago, the state of Israel revoked the visa from the Bishop of Jerusalem, so he couldn't visit his congregations. He couldn't go visit his own congregations. And these are Anglican Palestinian Christians. I mean, he couldn't. And so, I mean, it's very, very challenging. But at the same time, there's a reality of I have a very good friend of mine who's an Episcopal priest and whose wife is Jewish. And she often finds some vague anti-Semitic undercurrents in discussions of Israel, in the Episcopal Church as well, and in liberalism as well. And that's something we liberals don't do a very good job realizing and recognizing, is that these anti-Semitic approaches and words, and they're very easy to fall into. So I can't fix any of this, which is why I prefer to just study a Bronze Age text, an 8th century text about a Bronze Age conquest, and figure out those are enough problems for me than the modern ones. But I think you're right, Nancy. It's and at the same time, I mean, I can't really blame them. Lord knows I've seen Christians use texts in the Bible to commit atrocities all over the place. And so for me to be like, oh, how dare those Jewish people read the Bible like that, when tons of Christians have done equal, if not even more horrible things, pointing to Scripture's justification. So we all kind of suck at this.
Speaking of books, I am reading Cast, Isabel Wilkerson. Is anyone? Yeah.
Oh,
I would like to just say that I reviewed it before Oprah talked about it, but
I just got it because I've been on the waiting list at the library rather than rushing out and buying it. That was hard to wait.
you could have borrowed it from me.
You do know that Karen owns all the books, right? She literally, she could turn her house into a Barnes and Noble.
Wow.
Well, this has been fun. We went a little bit over tonight, but I'm really glad, because I think this was some important conversation. Oh yeah, Tony, you got a last thought?
this was when you talked about reading a novel in Google and how you want to. When I was a young man, I could actually finish a novel or a book. Today, I spend so much time looking up stuff that it often remains unread.
Oh no, this is a real danger. Is you get in a rabbit hole, like you read a weird
Yeah.
thing in a book, you're like, oh, what's that about? And then you spend an hour researching for one page in a book. Yeah, no, it's very hard. It's a challenge. The struggle is real. Well, thank you all. Have a good night. Enjoy your break, and I'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
trip.
Have a good
Fun in
vacation.
Nashville.
Thank you.